Pot of Greed is by far one of the most iconic Yu-Gi-Oh! Spell cards, if not one of the most iconic Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards just in general, and many games have their own version of it. There are broken versions of Pot of Greed, like Bill from the early days of Pokemon, but I think more so we're thinking about balanced versions of Pot of Greed, like the eventual Pokemon Draw supporter cards, as well as Arcane Intellect and Hearthstone, and there are plenty of draw spells in Yu-Gi-Oh! And in other card games, but Pot of Greed sort of stands as the king of all of them, at least when we're referring to Yu-Gi-Oh! And in today's video, I want to talk about why Pot of Greed is banned and why it pretty much can never come back to standard Yu-Gi-Oh! One of the reasons that Pokemon can have a card that says discard your hand and draw 7 cards, and Yu-Gi-Oh! Can't even have a card that says draw 2 cards, is pretty much the difference between Yu-Gi-Oh! And most card games, and that's that Yu-Gi-Oh! Doesn't have a mana system or an energy system or a land system. That isn't found in Yu-Gi-Oh! If you want to, you can pretty much build a deck with all immediately playable cards, which is very different from those other card games. Now, when I mentioned Bill earlier, Bill is a card that probably was too good for old school Pokemon because that was before they made items and supporters. If you don't know, in Pokemon, supporter cards can only be played once per turn, which really just puts a preemptive nerf on any supporter card that they print, because they know if they print a whole bunch of good supporter cards that each player can only activate one of them a turn. Now, the problem with a card like Pot of Greed in Yu-Gi-Oh! Specifically is that if you have Pot of Greed in your hand, it's not like your one spell card for that turn. You can just activate Pot of Greed and keep going. And in old school Yu-Gi-Oh! This wasn't as big of a deal. Now, I do want to say that it was a big enough deal to have this card be limited in 2003 on the first ban list, but Pot of Greed was allowed to be limited, not banned, up until late 2005, right after GOAT format was a huge deal, and that really goes to show that even back in 2005, Pot of Greed was already showing signs of being broken. Now, if you think back to 2003 Yu-Gi-Oh! When Pot of Greed was limited, the game was infinitely slower than it is right now. It pretty much doesn't even look the same. Almost your entire deck was made up of normal monsters and normal summonable monsters, and special summons were few and far between. I know a lot of people like to use the phrase that special summons back in the day actually felt special, where nowadays it's actually more rare to see a normal summon, and special summons are all over the place. But whether or not you agree that that's a good thing or a bad thing, the fact remains that back in the day, special summons just weren't around as much, which meant that when you used Pot of Greed, oftentimes you were drawing into cards that you couldn't immediately play, and that kind of goes back into what I was saying earlier, where you now can make a deck, and really what you're trying to make when you build a strategy is you're just trying to play as many cards that you can immediately activate as possible, which is very different from back in the day. And in 2005, when Pot of Greed was finally put on the Forbidden and Limited list, where it has stayed for over 10 years now, that's where Konami saw the game going, so they had to preemptively hit Pot of Greed. And if you've played GOAT format matches, it's really a very popular format right now. People go back and play those 2005 decks. You'll know that when a bad player has Pot of Greed and the better player does not have Pot of Greed, very often that worst player will actually win just because they draw 2 cards. And that brings me to my next point, and that's all about card advantage. Now, I mentioned card advantage in a lot of videos, and I think Pot of Greed is a perfect example of why card advantage is so important, especially because Pot of Greed is pretty straightforward. All you do is draw 2 cards, which makes analyzing the card advantage of Pot of Greed very simple. So the Pot of Greed card advantage is a +1, and that is not a +2 because you're actually trading 1 card in your hand, being the Pot of Greed, for 2 cards from your deck. So if you have 1 card, if your only 1 card is Pot of Greed, and then you activate it, you start with 1 card and end with 2 cards, so you got a +1 in card economy, and that's really important. But when you scale that upwards to an opening hand, especially in modern Yu-Gi-Oh sense, that can be a big deal. So let's take, for example, you go first and you have 5 cards, and you do your normal play, you end with 5 cards. Now your opponent goes second and they draw 6 cards, but one of their cards is Pot of Greed, so they activate the Pot of Greed and now they have 7 cards. So here's what happens happens. If every single one of their cards one-for-one trades with all of your cards, they now have 2 cards and you have none, and that is a huge deal. And I think when we really put it into that perspective, you can kind of see why card advantage is so important. If you can play cards but your opponent is out of cards, obviously you're going to win. So the reason people play so many cards that are pluses in card economy, not just strictly speaking about Pot of Greed, but just in general why you want to have cards that are pluses in your deck, is because you don't want to be the one without any plays. You want to put your opponent into a simplified game state where they only have like 1 or 2 cards to your 4 or 5. Beyond this, I think the biggest argument that I hear in favor of bringing Pot of Greed back, as far as my own comment section goes, is a lot of people say that their rogue deck or their casual strategy would actually have a fighting chance against the top meta decks if they were allowed to play Pot of Greed. And here's the problem with that, and this is kind of a thing that I talked about in a previous video where I said Yu-Gi-Oh! Is for 2 players. What a lot of those commenters don't seem to realize is that if their casual and rogue strategies are allowed to play Pot of Greed, then so are the meta decks, and the difference is that the meta decks will just become even better if they have Pot of Greed. However, your deck, your rogue deck, your casual deck, probably can't beat those meta decks without drawing your 1 copy of Pot of Greed, which means that still, even if your deck has access to Pot of Greed, your opponent doesn't have to actually draw theirs to beat you, whereas you have to draw yours to beat them, and that just creates a really sacky environment. And obviously, I don't think people are making arguments for Pot of Greed coming back to 3 copies per deck. Even casual players can usually see why that's not such a good idea. However, I do see the argument a ton of times in my own comment section and in other videos, especially banlist discussions, where people say, we just need Pot of Greed back at 1 because my deck would be so much better. And I think a lot of people really do forget about that. If you have access to cards, so does your opponent, and that really just sort of doesn't change the gap between rogue decks and casual decks versus meta decks. That doesn't change the gap at all because both players have access to the same crazy draw spell. However, if you look at the current formats, when we only have 5 cards going first versus the 6 of old school Yu-Gi-Oh!, even with only having those 5 cards, oftentimes the boards people are making are completely ridiculous. Do you really want to deal with the best decks having access to Pot of Greed? I know I sure don't, and I think if you really sit down and think about it, you probably won't want them to have that card either. So far, we've talked about why Pot of Greed is super powerful, and we've talked about why Pot of Greed doesn't actually help casual strategies, but I think one argument that is more important now than it ever has been as to why Pot of Greed cannot come back is we have to remember there is a strictly worse version of Pot of Greed in Pot of Desires. It has everything that you don't want in a card. It banishes 10 cards from your deck. It's a hard once per turn effect, and yet people are still playing that card. It is one of the most popular spell cards in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! It fits into basically every single deck out there, or at least 90% of them, and that card has so many drawbacks, and I know that I mentioned in other videos that many times the drawbacks don't matter in the grand scheme of things, but it certainly is a much bigger drawback than Pot of Greed, which has the same effect without a condition. And I think we can just look at that and say, okay, if a card like Pot of Desires, a card that banishes a quarter of your deck, is seeing competitive success for years, are we really in a position to be adding Pot of Greed back into the game? And the answer, pretty much objectively, is no. If people are willing to banish a quarter of their deck to draw 2 cards, they sure as heck are going to be wanting to play a card like Pot of Greed, where you have no drawback and there's no risk at all. Yeah, people are going to play that card. It'll see play in every single deck. And I think the last couple times I said that, a couple people, they always like get me in the comments. They say things like, oh, Super Heavy Samurais wouldn't play the card, or Infernity wouldn't play that card. Maybe in the case of Super Heavy Samurais that is true, but Infernity definitely would have played Pot of Greed. But the fact of the matter is that Pot of Greed, more so than Pot of Desires, is the most generic card in the entire game and would likely see play in 99.9999 repeating percentages of decks, and that is a huge deal. Konami doesn't want cards that generic in every single deck available. That makes for stagnant gameplay because instead of building a 40 40 card deck, you're now building a 39 card deck because you always know that your 40th card will be Pot of Greed. And in those cases, I know some people are going to say, but Doug, in the modern metagame, isn't every single deck the same 40 cards? That is just not true at all. And even popular cards like Pot of Desires and like Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, those types of cards actually don't see play in every single deck or every single format, which makes it very different from Pot of Greed, which actually would see play in every single deck. Because the difference between a card like Pot of Greed and a card like Raigeki or Dark Hole is that Raigeki and Dark Hole do have chances to be dead cards in your hand. You can't always activate them, especially when you consider you can't activate them going first. It makes them a lot worse in a 2018 setting. However, in the case of Pot of Greed, you can always activate it. You can always get 2 free draws. And I know people are going to say we can ash it, or it gets stopped by Droll, or maybe you are going to deck out. Obviously those cases do happen, but the point is that Konami seems to not want to make cards like Pot of Greed anymore that are so unconditional and just have all upside. And that makes a lot of sense because Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a much faster card game than many other card games out there because there isn't a mana system or resource system, and you can just play everything immediately, which makes a card like Pot of Greed that just gives you more access to your cards really toxic to the game. And I think especially if the card was limited, whichever player drew their copy of Pot of Greed would be at such a huge advantage, whether or not they were going first or second, that it would just create a horrible play environment as far as competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Went. Anyway though, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video and this brief snapshot of the history of Pot of Greed. I really don't think Konami will ever bring this card back after being banned for so long. It just seems too good. I think too many people would play it. Konami doesn't really want that to happen. If you guys knew this video, please let me know in the comment section below, and I will see you later. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.